Good evening, everyone. Can everyone? Oh, yeah, we can. It's nice and loud. As far as you know, can you people on Zoom hear me, Helen? Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Kakubra History Society. I'm Mike Duckett, the chairman. We have a Zoom audience from across the world, from America and Australia and New Zealand. But I'm delighted to open this season's first talk. And as you can see from all this paraphernalia in front of me, we're trying to create a much more realistic scenario where the speaker is now standing at the lectern as opposed to hiding behind a laptop, which happened previously. To make this happen, though, Helen has to be at the back with a Zoom laptop. We have a camera set up. And all the speakers have to come to the lectern in turn with their microphones. So bear with us. This is the first time we've done this live, so we're unpracticed, and we already had a mess with the lights, so that was a good start. But if it does all work, then we have a huge vote of thanks to Ron McHugh up at the top there, and to Bruce Mackenzie, who's kept us right in the practices. If it all goes wrong, just blame me, because I've obviously done something stupid. So, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, we would not have picked the first talk to be by 5 different speakers, excluding me. So there'll be a lot of toing and froing. But having said that, I know that we're in for an interesting meeting. I'm delighted to hand over now to Claire Williamson. Claire's a senior archaeologist with the Rathmel Archaeology, and we probably know her best as the leader of the Can You Dig It for the Galloway Glens Landscape Project. And tonight, this is the last of the series of that Can You Dig It program, so we'll be sad to see it finish, the Galloway Glens. But it involves, well, in fact, I'll let Claire tell you about what the project involves. So, ladies and gentlemen, Claire Williamson.
Hi, everyone. This is going to take a bit of getting used to, but I quite like the mic setup. Oh, hi. Okay. Right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming along tonight, and thank you for that lovely introduction. That was nice. So I'm going to try and keep my part brief, so that we can get on to the more exciting speakers that we have this evening. Next
slide, is it?
Yeah. It's all going smoothly. I don't know. Has it turned itself off? I can hit the arrow button. Yeah. Right, everybody. Well, I suppose if that's the worst that happens, it's not that bad. So, as was introduced, I was helping deliver Can You Dig It, which was a community archaeology project for the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership. So the Galloway Glens Partnership ran for the last 5 years. As a lot of you know, it was funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Thank you. And Can You Dig It, which was their community archaeology project, was running for the last 4 years with match funding from Historic Environment Scotland. So it was all about kind of engaging communities with their local natural and built heritage. And we were able to put on a series of workshops, digs, guided tours, various things, all free of charge, thanks to all of our funders, which was amazing. Unfortunately, Galloway Glens and Can You Dig It came to an end in the last couple of weeks, actually, just at the end of last month. But you can find all of our reports, all of the results from our projects, all available online on the Glenkens Hub website. And there's also a series of talks recorded on the YouTube channel for Galloway Glens, and that's all still available as well. So all is not lost. But tonight, smooth. Tonight, it's all about building biographies. So this is the project that, shall I move back one? Yeah. Just showing off now. So tonight's all about building biographies. So this was one of our online research projects. So it was all about getting volunteers everybody was assigned their own country house, across Galloway, and they were then set to try and piece together as much of its history as possible, right from when it was initially built through to how it stands today, if it still stands. And we gave them a kind of guidance note. It was done over 4 months, kind of spring, summer this year. And we gave a kind of list of resources. So most of these were online, but there were some that you could go to your local library and archive. But for it being online, it made archaeology, for once, more accessible to people that can't necessarily come out to a dig on site. So the kind of volunteer research projects have been quite popular. So they ended up doing houses all across Galloway, but I'm not going to lie, there was 2 or 3 that sneaked in from Dumfriesshire because I couldn't say no. There were so many people that wanted to take part, but they all wanted to make it areas close to themselves. So we included houses that were kind of demolished, still standing, or ruinous. So we didn't kind of neglect. The only thing that I maybe tried to avoid including in the list was any houses that had a lot of research already done. So if they had comprehensive, books or websites already dedicated to their history, then we didn't really include them because we didn't want anyone to think that they were going over, well-covered ground kind of thing. We did kind of focus on the Galloway Glens area, which is that kind of central portion kind of that runs from Carsfair and down to Castle Douglas and down to Kirkcudbright. But like I say, people came from all over the region, so if they wanted a house nearer to them or there was a specific house that they were interested in, yeah, I couldn't say no. I don't think I even tried, to be honest, but I'm not going to. But it was good. So we got quite a mix of houses. We ended up with 42 houses reported back, and that's a big list. I don't expect you to read all that. It was just more the visual aid to show you all of the reports. And everybody put in their findings as a kind of summary report in whatever style that they fancied. And in the end, we compiled them into 7 volumes, about 100 pages each. And they are all available on the Glen Kens Hub website to download. I've also emailed them out to Historic Scotland, the Dumfries and Galloway Heritage Service, the Archaeology Service, and Dumfries Museums are also going to have a copy. And yeah, all the local societies were included as well. And anyone, so please share, download, share. It's for using and making use of. But I suppose the only thing I wanted to say was, obviously, all buildings have a story to tell, and we're kind of keen for everybody to research whatever factory, farmstead, World War II ordnance factory that they would fancy recording. But for this one, we ended up picking country houses, the kind of big, large houses, for a couple of reasons. Their longevity, a lot of them have stood since the 1800s, if not earlier, many earlier actually. And it's kind of, they're from a bygone era, so they kind of represent society as it was at that time, the very upstairs, downstairs, class system, symbols of status. It was all relating to having to own land and show that you owned land in order to get into politics. There was various aspects of it. But also throughout the years, they've kind of stood, or not stood in some cases, as society, politics, social, economic views have shifted over time. And a lot of them were kind of modified to survive these changes. Hospitals, schools, hotels, and then quite a large number of them actually were used in the war effort as well. And I think what's lovely, and you'll see that even from the examples tonight, is they do reveal both the good and the bad of our history, because there's a bit of everything in them, as well as local, as well as national history. There's a lot to learn from these buildings, and I think everyone did a really massive, an amazing amount of work uncovering all their histories. So, do you want me to press at the same time to pretend it's so smooth? Thank you. So tonight, though, we have 4 of our volunteers that are going to each talk about one house each that they researched. We've got our Grennan House, Sennick House, Berwinnock, and Fluda. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to Will Williams, who's going to start off by talking about our Grennan House. I will take this.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right? Things are working here. Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. Mine was a Grennan House, and I think I'll go back to Claire's slide, really, because that's where a Grennan House is. It's north of Kirkcudbright through Tongland And just before you get to the A75, there it is on the right. You can't see the house from the road, but that's what you'll see from the road. And I'd driven past this for many years, wondering what was behind these gates. Sorry, can you hear me all right? Yeah. I wondered what was behind the gates, so I was very pleased to get Agrenan to look at. I think it was my request anyway. Anyway, that's what's behind the gates. And some or many of you may have been there, and I'll come on to that later really, but beautiful classic house when you get beyond the gates. It was built in two phases. There is the kind of backside of it that really is an 18th century house. And to the right, which is the photograph that you saw earlier, really is the 1818 extension of the house. And it's attributed to James Gillespie Graham. There are very poor records about the house being built and the architect. And architects have deduced that it's likely to have been him rather than we've got exact proof. So there is a Grennan house in its own grounds. To the top right, you'll see the River Dee. It's about, 40 acres now. In the past, it did have 3 kind of big farms associated with it. But there is the new 1818 frontage looking out onto the grounds of Grennan. I'm no expert on Gaelic and Norse, so I offer that as the explanation that I've managed to get to, that is translated as Green Hill, which is very appropriate because it's on a green hill. Right. I'm going to spend most of my short time talking about the people that lived and occupied the house, but I just thought I'd show you some photographs of the inside because it's rather beautiful and classical. These photographs are from Stratton Parker when it was for sale a few years ago. So that's the entrance hall, a dining room as you'd expect with beautiful portraits all around, the lounge with beautiful bay windows outlooking over the grounds, and a basement kitchen. So if you do get inside, that's what you'll see really. So I'm going to move on really to talk a bit about the owners and the people that have lived there. And we owe a lot to the Gordons because they owned the land when the original house was built. They also owned the land when the 1818 extension was built. So the assumption is that they built both parts of the house. Again, we have no documentary proof, but that's where we are. And the Gordons, they're the Gordons from Campbellton. I thought Campbellton was down in Argyll. So I just looked at the spelling again, and eventually I went to this place called Campbellton, which is just southwest of Twynham. I'd found nothing about this in the literature. And there I found the stables of the Gordons' home of Campbellton. And maybe that's the only bit of truly original research in this, but I kind of found it myself. It's used for parking cars now, but it was the stables really. And the Gordons, I think it's quite significant that they chose Kirkcudbright graveyard for where the various generations of the Gordons were buried. And it's that middle, I won't upset this one because it's a bit temperamental, but it's the middle white one that just cuts the skyline. That is the grave of the Gordons family, surrounded by railings. And it's impossible to read it, but there is a beautiful publication in the library. They've transcribed all the inscriptions up to 1940, and it's fantastic. But anyway, that's my proof again that the William Gordon that owned the land, that's his father from the family tree that I produced for the Gordons. So moving on, in 1836 we have the Kerr family appearing. And This is Robert Kerr. He was a plantation merchant in Grenada, and he'd been there for quite a few decades with his brother James. But just before 1836, they came back, and they did go and live in Edinburgh. He married Elizabeth Innes Kerr. I wouldn't go into the Innes bit, but they occupied the house. He was a very wealthy guy. He came back with lots of money. What's a bit surprising is that the Gordon family appeared in 1863, and I couldn't figure out what was going on here. So with a bit more research, I've discovered that the two families were related. The two families did have houses round about Liverpool, Birkenhead. So some arrangement came about, for the Gordon family to live there for about 10 years. William Gordon had been a diamond merchant in Brazil, and he came back with quite a lot of money, about 250,000 then. And for some convenient arrangement, the family lived in Ogrennan. There were about 10 of them, plus 5 servants, so it was quite a house full. Dorothy Miller, his first wife, died, so when he came to Ogrennan, William Gordon was with Margaret Steele and the family. But he had other aspirations. He's the William Gordon that bought the land at Thrieve and built a Thrieve house that's now in the hands of the National Trust. So the Gordons moved on. There were a different Gordon from the original ones. This William Gordon actually was born in Montrose, not Campbellton, but you've got to be careful going into the Gordons, otherwise you're in Gordon of Khartoum, and you've lost days then. Anyway, so back to the Kerr family, because they're the ones that owned it. But Robert Kerr had died before the Gordon family moved in. And he is buried in Tongland. Just
They can't see you because you walked off the camera.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to see the screen. Apologies to everybody on Zoom. Robert Kerr, there is the family area just behind the church in Tongland. So that's where he's buried. His will was very controversial, and it actually went to the House of Lords to be resolved. The Kerr family did continue to live there, and that's his son living on at Ogrennan. Claire said that we had to follow our interests. So this was a total tangent, because I'd kind of assembled the Kerr family tree, and I found that a James George Innes Kerr had gone to Australia in a Marco Polo. And after hours and hours, you do produce something because you need to know about the relationships. And this lady on the left, Sandra, I have eventually found her in Adelaide. And tonight, ladies and gentlemen, she is on Zoom, really. Sandra is here from Adelaide in Kirkcudbright Parish Hall. It's a deathly early hour in Adelaide, so hopefully she's got plenty of coffee with her. But it took me into another dimension that I wasn't planning to, but a member of the Kerr family also wrote a book about the settlement of the Kerrs in Australia. The last entry we've got for the Kerr family is this small grave of Lucy Hodgson, who really was somebody that lived with the family and helped to look after the family at Tongland. Then we move on to 1915. It was occupied by the Aikman sisters, quite a lengthy time. I think about 70 or 80 years. It was James Aikman that bought the house. He was the chairman of the Scottish Rugby Union, and he facilitated Murrayfield coming into the pitch now used by the national Scottish rugby team. He bought it, and it was his two daughters that lived in it. And it was quite a reclusive existence. After 1921, the census information doesn't help you because you can't access it. So this is from kind of newspapers, really, and it's about getting some feel for the life that they did lead, really. But they were very reclusive, with their kind of a few servants in the house and a gardener. And the house wasn't looked after as well as it should have. And then we move on to Bob Redway, who I'm very pleased is sitting in the audience. So if you have any difficult questions, Bob will help us. But Bob and Tulane Kidd really had it for almost kind of 20 years. They put an incredible amount of love and care into this house. They restored it, and they did more than that. They opened it to the public for charity events and so on. And if I can read it from here, Bob gave the first lecture of the Kirkcudbright Literary Society on the way that they'd restored Agrenan House. So it was a good time. And when I said earlier, many of you may have been there, that would have been the time. In fact, some of you may have worked there for all I know. We're coming to the end of the occupation of Agrenan, but Alistair Flanagan, he was an engineer, he bought it. He married his lovely wife Gail there, and that gave them the idea of having it as a wedding venue, which it was for about 20 years. And finally, and very recently, it's now in the ownership of RSK. They're an umbrella company that has about 150 environmental companies within the kind of consortium, and they use it for environmental, working with nature, sustainability work. And you can see they're working really hard here. This is clearly a working dinner, maybe, which is an incredible irony, really, because this is the field that I used to work in before I retired. And just the thought of up the road, you know, there they are working on this. So that's Agrenan House. That's your first talk for the night, and that's a quick summary of who was there and a few images to finish off with. Thank you.
Right, good evening, everyone. Senneck House is a B-listed house in Bourg Parish. It's described on the listed building's website as being built in the early 19th century. In the early 20th century, the house had been very much altered both inside and out, and more recently the interior has undergone huge alterations in its years as a hotel and later conversion to a care home. Senneck House is situated in southwest Scotland, a couple of miles to the southwest of Kirkcudbright, with a view over Brighouse Bay and the Solway. Although there are several buildings in the vicinity of Senneck House which are recorded on Historic Scotland or Canmore website, one of the few original features left which relate to the house itself are the spheres on the gateposts, which have actually been scheduled. The present owners believe that the current Senneck House was preceded by a cottage come farmhouse, the remains of which may still survive in the garden walls. Roy's map of the area, drawn between 1752 and 1755, shows a building with extensive gardens, so this appears to bear this out. I think I might, yeah, it's that one. The present house is thought to have been built in 1760 by the Corries. Although Macaulay, in his book History of the Lands and Owners in Galloway, says that the Blairs of Senwick sold Senwick House estate to the Corries in 1779. William Corrie had made a large fortune as a Scotch trader, that's linen, not whisky, and lace manufacturer in Wellingborough in Northamptonshire. When William Corrie died in 1811, his fortune passed to his daughter Jane. When she died in 1828 with no direct heirs, Adam Corrie, her cousin, inherited everything, including Senwick House. The OS name book, written between 1848 and 51, described Senwick House as being a small but neat mansion of the modern style of architecture, with outhouses all slate and in good repair. In front of the mansion is a pleasantly ornamental garden surrounded by a small plantation consisting of mixed wood. There is also a farm of land, the property of John Corrie, Esquire of Dunrod. John Corrie, who had inherited Senwick House from his father Adam Corrie, died there in 1874 at the age of 80. According to the census, John Corrie seems to have spent most of his time living in England, but may have retired to Senwick after the death of his wife in Milan in 1870. It was probably Adam Corrie, John's son, who added the porch and dormer windows designed by the architects Kinnear and Peddy in 1879. He and his wife lived at Senwick for a few years during the 1880s. In 1896, Senwick House was bought by Captain John Hope, a nephew of the Earl of Selkirk, and became part of the St Mary's Isle estate. Presumably, like the Corries before him, he did not live there very much, as 3 years later he tried to let the house. The advert said Senwick House had 3 public rooms, 5 bedrooms, a dressing room, as well as 4 servants' rooms. It also had a tennis court. It was to be let partly furnished. Many adverts appeared in the Scotsman over the next few years, so it would appear that he was not having much luck in renting the property out. By 1911, Senwick House was occupied by Sir Charles Hope Dunbar, the son of Captain John Hope. He made a lot of changes and improvements to Senwick House, extending the house by almost doubling its size. He was responsible for laying out much of the gardens. In its Edwardian heyday, the gardens had a tennis court, bowling green, and several greenhouses. Captain Basil Hope Dunbar, Sir Charles's son, planted many daffodils in the grounds. He bought bulbs from catalogues and travelled to the Netherlands to buy new varieties. And a few years after the death of Captain Hope Dunbar, Senwick was bought by Innis Ireland in 1972. Ireland had moved to Kirkcudbright as a toddler when his father got a job as a vet. He was a bit of a daredevil, and as a young man, Innis Ireland had driven his car out onto the ice of Carlingwalk Loch, although I have since heard that he wasn't the only one to try this. After serving in the Paras and the King's Own Scottish Borderers, he took up motor racing in 1959, driving for Lotus. He was the first Scottish driver to win a Grand Prix first place, winning at Watkins Glen in the United States. In 1962, he was voted one of the UK's best-dressed men, and in the same year was elected president of the British Racing Drivers Club. He later worked as a journalist on a motoring magazine before returning to Kirkcudbright area in the early 70s and buying Senwick House. He only lived there for a few years before putting the house up for sale in 1976. Whilst living at Senwick, Ireland operated a small fishing boat out of the harbour. Later that year, Pius Adrian Baines bought Senwick House and converted it into a hotel. By 1981, Senwick House had become a family-run country house hotel set in 12 acres of woodlands overlooking the sea. It was reported as having one of the finest shows of daffodils in southwest Scotland. The hotel was described as having 4 reception rooms, 11 bedrooms, of which 5 were en suite, a basement flat, 10 acres of gardens and sea views. Richard Baines, the curator of Logan Botanic Gardens, moved to Senwick House when he was 10. In a podcast, he said that the gardens were beautifully laid out by German prisoners of war. The garden had a collection of over 200 cultivars of daffodils. To this day, I still think Senwick House had probably one of the most spectacular displays of daffodils in the whole of the UK. In May 1986, Senwick House was put up for sale. It was bought by the Tonks family. A few months later, it was undergoing conversion work to meet the needs of elderly and frail people. Senwick House was to take on its current role as a residential home. After a couple of years, the Tonks sold it to the present owners, Geraldine and Tanya Alston. For much of its existence, Senwick was occupied by tenants. And as I do not have time to talk about all the people who rented Senwick House, I shall restrict myself to a couple of them. Oddly, one such tenant of the house was Sir John Gordon of Earlston and Afton. Sir John was born in Montego Bay, Jamaica in 1780 and later served in the 1st Regiment of Foot. He succeeded as the 5th Baronet of Earlston and Afton in 1795 after the death of a distant cousin. I couldn't find any pictures of plantation life on his plantations, but that is in the same county, so they're sort of similar. Sir John married Juliana Gallimore on the 19th of April 1811 at Trelawney, Cornwall, Jamaica. Juliana was the daughter of Colonel Jarvis Gallimore of the Greenfield estate and Sarah Virgo. Juliana was born at Greenfield in 1782. Her mother, Sarah Virgo, had died in 1809 and in her will had left Juliana, Old Kitter, Madge, Johnny and Becky to hold the said slaves with their future offspring and increase. Juliana Gallimore died at Senwick House in 1824 at the age of 42. Her memorial is in Senwick Church, although it is much worn and difficult to read. A story is related that when Juliana died, she was buried in the Blair portion of the churchyard and a tablet was erected. The Blairs, however, took exception to this and ordered its removal. There was even talk of exhumation, and although this did not happen, the memorial tablet was removed to its present place. On the 21st of June, 1825 in Edinburgh, just over a year after Juliana had died, Sir John Gordon remarried and with his new wife, Mary Irving of Dumfries, went to visit Senwick House. The London Star reported that the tenantry and respectable farmers prepared bonfires to honour the happy couple. On the couple reaching Senwick, there was a discharge of cannon and musketry and cheering by the fires. Local gossip suggested Sir John left Senwick on Whit Sunday in 1828 and that no new tenant had been found. Like the Gallimores, Sir John also had estates in Jamaica and in 1836 received compensation of £3,316 5 shillings for the 164 enslaved persons on his Carlton estate. In his will, he stated that he had sold his Golden River coffee estate to his reputed natural sons, Francis and John. Senwick House has another West Indian link. On December 19, 1819, Major General Rial, Governor of Grenada and hero of the Canadian Wars, proposed to Eliza Scarlett of Peru in Jamaica while staying at Senwick House. Eliza was the eldest son of James Scarlett and Eliza Virgo Scarlett, née Gallimore. Eliza accepted, and the couple went on to have 2 daughters. Eliza was later to receive compensation for the 53 enslaved people working on her Jamaican estate. A later tenant of Senec House was William Poole. He was appointed to the Borg Academy as a schoolmaster on the 23rd of March, 1803, where he remained until 1843. After he retired from the academy, he rented Senec House. He lived there with his daughter Jessie, and local belief was that he had been forced to resign before he was pushed, as he favoured the Free Church, where he was a trustee and practising elder. William and Jessie Poole lived in Senec House until 1865, when William Poole died aged 85. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thanks so much, Jenny. That was amazing. So we'll be moving on. I'll get a wee clicker. But I think Senec House is just a lovely, just in that 15 minutes, you can see all the different connections that it had and different snippets of history, both near and far, that we were able to get glimpses of just by researching one house in Borg. But to carry on the amazing stuff, here is Janet, who's going to talk about Barwinick House, which is in Twynham. It's not turned on. How do I click it on? I think it should be on. All right, it's not on. Is it turned on? It should be turned on. I'll know soon enough if it's not turned on.
Good evening. My research tonight has been on the Big Hoose at Barwinick in Twynham Parish. But first of all, what was the Big Hoose? In Scotland, landowning was a symbol of the seat of power. And by the early 1700s, there was a period of relative calm. And by now, castles had been replaced by lairds who lived in a mansion house on their estates, surrounded by the farms that they owned. By the end of the 1700s, Scotland was enjoying a period of greater wealth, and the result was that many of the lairds wished to upgrade their properties. The consequence of that was that during the period from around the 1750s to the 1850s, there was an explosion of Big Hoose building. Most were big and some were very big. Fast forward to 2023, today, society over the last 200 years has changed dramatically. The cost of maintenance of these old mansions is prohibitive, with the result that many have been sold as hotels, nursing homes, or subdivided for multiple occupancies. But Barwinick is special. First of all, you can see that it's not looking as if it is a big house. We'll look at it more closely. Oh, sorry, first of all, it is described quite recently as being a deliciously smart country house villa, and the interior is just as classy. Where is it? You can see the red A75 going from top right down along past Twynham, and as you go up the hill towards Berluca, on the top left of the map, you can see Barwinick. Now, the important thing about the route is that it follows at this point exactly the same route as the old toll road, which consistently throughout the adverts in its history was an important feature of it. The mail coach passed twice a day. But all that you will see is the lodge house halfway up that slope from between Twynham Village, Road End and Berluca. On the right-hand side, you will see the lodge house. You will not see anything of the house itself. Oops. It was part of the old barony of Twynham, granted to a James Macmillan in the 1450s. So it has a long record of Macmillans being there. Macmillans were there in the 1500s, the 1600s, and the 1700s. And we're going to follow the history from around then. The lairds between 1745 and 1919 were all Macmillans. There was one, the very first one, had land confiscated for backing the wrong side in 1745. The next one took great pride in the agrarian revolution and modernising Berwinock estate. The next one followed suit, but also brought money from the sugar plantations in Jamaica. And the next one was an absentee landlord, and it's actually the absentee landlord who has provided us with a lot of information because he rented out the property. And the information that we get from his adverts are really what has helped us in this. And from 1919 until now, 2023, there have been 7 owner-occupiers. Not rented out at all owner-occupiers. William McKee was in it very briefly, but then we had the family of the Laying Wrights, the Murdochs, the Bourne-Mays, the Oakeshots, the Hazards, and now the Coulters. And the most amazing thing about every single one of these families is that everyone has contributed greatly to the maintenance of the fabric of the house and to the garden. It has never been left untended, and the estate. Oops. To go back to James Macmillan, who was born round about 1746 and died in 1809. That was the period of the agrarian revolution, and like most of the lairds locally, he was a very enthusiastic agricultural improver. He also became sufficiently affluent to consider the beautification of his estate. I've included that because it's a John Gallone map, John Gallone being a forefather of the present Alistair. And this is a blow-up of a bit of it. On the bottom right, you can see the old toll road. It's faintly pink. And from the bottom middle, you can see a driveway going up towards an oval. That is a walled garden. Before 1800, a walled garden. We'll look at it later. Swing up or around the trees to the right, and you come up to the black building at the top. And that is where James Macmillan had his commodious and comfortable mansion house on the left side of the driveway. Continue left round the trees over the burn to the top left corner, and you have got the farmyard. That would be a newly built farmyard. And in these days, the farms round about that were part of the estate were Berluca, Millflat, the Doon, Nethermains, Redfield, and Twynham Mains. Most of these farms were sold off during the next 100 years, so that by the 1920s, it was only Twynham Mains that remained, and it was sold also. So the estate nowadays is approximately 80 acres, which is still fairly large. After the death of James in 1809, there was a raup of the Berwinock estate. A raup being a very common word then, and even in my childhood, but kind of lost nowadays. it is a public auction on site. And in the advert for that, it says coal and lime are imported and the produce of the estate exported at the harbour at tariff. Now, that is kind of astonishing because we have Barwhinnock up in the top left, and if we go right down to the bottom right, follow the River Dee up to here, and if we go to the Tungland Bridge, there is a port there, the port of Tungland. That wasn't what they used. They came up the Dee, and instead of turning right up to that port, they went straight ahead up to Cumston, which nowadays, as we know, is completely mud banks and everything else, difficult to imagine. But these little coal boats actually popped all round the coast here. They were very common. So James had died, and he was followed by Patrick Laurie Macmillan. And he also had been an owner of a sugar plantation in Jamaica. He came back home. He was a well-educated and a well-travelled man. He returned to Barwhinnock, where he was well-respected locally and nationally. He was on the board of the Bank of Scotland. He was on the board of the Scottish Agricultural Society, which was a forerunner of the Highland Show. He was an enthusiastic member of the Liberal Party, which was extremely lively in these days. And he also bought shares in the proposed Dumfries to Kirkpatrick railway line. In other words, private enterprise, and he was taking the chance on his money. He also commissioned a new estate map. This was in 1834. It looks almost exactly as the last one, perhaps a few more trees, but you pass the oval garden, you go up, and then at the top of the drive, instead of there being a commodious and comfortable mansion house belonging to James, there's nothing to be seen of it. Instead, top right on the right-hand side of the drive is Barwhinnock House. Many of the trees that were built at this time are actually, the whole area had been denuded of trees during the 1700s. And one of the things that all the lairds did was plant trees. And some of these trees planted 200 years ago are still standing. So this is the new house. Obviously, this was a few years after because it's got creeper around it. But to give you a better idea of exactly the same house, this is exactly the house that was built 200 years ago. And we can see that it is not a huge looking house. In fact, it looks as if it is just one story. But it does have quite a lot of character. Go round the back, and we find that it is not a small house, it's a big house. And the idea of it being one story is a sort of optical illusion because it's a two-story house. Look at on the right-hand side at the build-on at the back door, which I may have time to refer to later. Oops. Okay. Go back to the front of the house, and let's go in that door. And that is what is ahead of you. Now, immediately ahead, as you enter the front door, you see this imposing double stairway. It's said that Patrick Laurie Macmillan based his new home on one he had seen. Was this in Scotland or Jamaica? In the southern plantation states of America, where he could easily have visited, Many mansions had petticoat stairs. In the early 1800s, ladies wore dresses with large hooped skirts. And to climb the stairs, these had to be lifted. And the men might see their ankles, which was very risky. So the answer was to build a double stairway, one side for the men and one for the women. Whether that's the answer or not, I don't know, but it's as good as any. The floorway here has been described as marble. It is not. It is slabs of sandstone which have been painted black and white. So the whole hallway is sandstone. Ahead of you, if you go through the door, on either side, there's a corridor running the length of the house. That is sandstone. The old butler's pantry, the kitchen would originally be sandstone. And the stairs are sandstone, painted. Anyhow, in 1845, Patrick Laurie Macmillan's only daughter, Margaret, married Captain James Irving. Now, this was a very happy day for Captain James Irving because his old father from Gribton and Dumfries had been a bit of a spendthrift. He himself wasn't too good with money, and here he was marrying an heiress with rather a lot of inherited money. But he found Scotland too cold. And that's where we win, because the result is that we now have 50 years of Macmillans renting out their property. And from all the adverts in these rental proposals in local papers and in national papers, we actually can glean a lot of information. One thing was repeatedly the importance of the toll road, the proximity to the toll road. It was, in fact, the toll road between Carlisle and Port Patrick and London. 369 miles to London by carriage. We've mentioned the coastal traders, the wee coal boats. In 1857, which was the first time that they let it out, the boast is that there is a direct steamboat from Kirkcudbright to Liverpool. Now, that must have been, previously they would have had to go by horse and carriage to Carlisle and then down to Liverpool. This would have been a dream on a good day in good weather. In 1883, Berwick is 2 miles from Tarf Station. Now, obviously, the railway line that his father-in-law had put money into had been completed, and the branch line to Kirkcudbright, but Tarf was a closer station than Kirkcudbright. And then by 1917, the railways were going strong, but again, in the advert for the house for sale, it quite clearly talks about the stabling for horses and garages for cars. So that, again, there's a transition there. All water was sourced within the estate. There's no public water supply, no public sewage system. In 1896, the advert says, water is brought to the house by gravitation and a modern system of drainage. Now, that meant that there was a dam had been there for many years, and they built a water tank up the field, and they built a sewage pit, which is a sewage tank, which is still in use. That would be for the very first flush toilet, not a bathroom, the very first flush toilet. And it has been suggested that in these days, most of the new toilets were put at the back door, because of course, a new toilet required quite a lot of plumbing, and to put that into an existing house was maybe a questionable thing to do. So a new toilet in 1896. By a sale brochure in 1923, we find there is a bathroom. And then by 1935, there are 3 bathrooms, which would suggest to me that by now they're in the public water supply. In 1929, the government decreed that all new builds must have a toilet. That's just new builds. Electricity, again in 1923, it was a busy time, 1923 for Berwinock. Water power for the sawmill and electric light. Now, at the top left, you can see a blue triangle. That is the dam. And running from the dam to the right and all the way down through the estate is the Kirk Burn. But to go back to the dam, there is a lead from the dam to the farmsteading. And in the farmsteading, there was a water wheel. The water wheel originally would have been for thrashing the corn, but in 1923, it was adapted with a pulley wheel and turbine to provide electricity. That's the diverted the Kirkburn. And here is where the water wheel was, bottom left, and the pulley wheel, and through that wall was the sawmill that they mentioned. Also in 1923, was this the first utility to be sourced out with the estate? It mentions a telephone, and these would have lines to Toynham village where there was a manned telephone exchange. In 1919, it was the end of the Macmillans, more Raups. Interestingly enough, for at least 2 of the Raups, it mentions that there was a break from the Royal Hotel in Kirkcudbright to Berwinock. That would be a shooting break, for those of you that remember what a shooting break was. It was just called a break. And it was a big event, believe you me. One of the things that was for sale was a pony lawn mowing machine. Here is the walled garden, the oval garden. Now, I said that was built by the old James. It predates the present house. It is more than 200 years old. This view is facing south, and you can see at the top of the wall, in the middle, there's a sort of reddish brick edifice raising the height of the wall. Behind that was where the glass houses were. And in 1857, it said in the advert, the garden is in full bearing with vinery and peach house. That is this year in March. Again, you can see more clearly that raised brick at the end of the wall, and the glass houses on the outside, facing south. No longer, the glass houses are not there. The rest of the garden has always been maintained. The southern half of the garden is in vegetables, and the northern half of the garden is an orchard. And that's this year. The estate, like the one at Sennick, like many others, seem to take great pleasure in looking after their rhododendrons, all sorts of things, and snowdrops, and daffodils, and bluebells. They just took pride in all of these things. 5 years ago, there was a change of ownership, and the following photos are taken from the sales brochure. Here is the entrance hall. If you go straight ahead there, under the stairway and straight ahead, there's a beautiful sitting room straight ahead. looking out the back of the house onto the garden there. To the right, we get a glimpse of the drawing room, and on the left is the dining room. There's the drawing room with the bow windows, and it actually has got a bowed wall on the other side. Here is the dining room, again, bowed windows, although not at the other end. There's a bedroom, and there was the kitchen. And I have included the last one, which is a photo of the kitchen today. They have opened up the breakfast room to make a very pleasant open area. In conclusion, why has the Big Hoose at Barwhinnock survived as a family home when so many others have not? Many reasons, but principally because 200 years ago, Patrick Laurie Macmillan bucked the trend, and instead of building a big house, he had the foresight to build a wee Big Hoose, but one with such character and elegance that it has survived to be a much loved, comfortable and commodious family home to this day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you, that was wonderful. It is nice to see there's a surprising number of the houses that were researched in the project that still actually survive as private homes today, which I was quite surprised at. But as Janet was saying, the big houses, I think, just became a bit of too much of a financial burden quite a lot in their kind of later lives. So if they couldn't be modified and sold on to become another, you know, a hotel or a hospital or something like that, then yes, so many of them ended up either demolished, or the roof tax meant that a lot got the roofs removed, which by the time you remove the roof, it's really not great for the rest of the building to survive after that point. But it's nice that we've got so many that are still surviving.
Right. Okay. Right.
But this is going to be our last talk of the evening.
Can you hear me?
And I will pass over to Bruce for Fluda, which is in Kirkcudbright.
Indeed.
Closer.
So, can you hear? No? Better? Right. Okay, I'll zip through. This is at Fluda, which is in, most of us probably know, just on the way out of Kirkcudbright. It's a more modest version compared to the other three, but it's got a lot of similarities and a lot of connections. So basically, it's a local landmark, it's a humble local landmark, but for much of its time, one of the reasons I chose it, it's a residence that's provided a refuge for ladies, either whose husbands had died or nieces who were inheriting property. And a surprising number of the owners, less so the tenants, have been either maiden ladies or widows or something of that description. It's not really been a family house. I think only one child has been born and brought into it, which is rather surprising. So that is a look today. I think in common with most people, I've pinched it off one of the estate agent pictures or the website. It's facing north. It's a smaller version than what we've seen. Quite a pleasant aspect, and I'll go into some of the background. But to me, it's been famous for its hospitality. It's been famous for its sort of refuge status for ladies, and it's also been famous for role it played in World War II, which I shall cover in a second. But where does it begin? Well, it's got a connection with our first speaker in that a Gordon from Campbellton married the owner. Grace was Gordon, and it's a Maitland house. And it's a reasonably complete list. We've got a Maitland, a Campbell, who was related to the Maitland, and then sailed to relatives, charters, sale to Palmer, Jackson, McAdam, and so on. And again, very similar to one of our other houses, most of the gentlemen who lived there married the heiress to get hold of Flodder. So there's a common theme developing here. If you want to get ahead, marry a rich woman. And so there, as we get towards the end, unlike the last house, it begins to decline a bit in the sort of 60s and 70s. And it's got a checkered history until the last three owners began to sort of put some money into it and restore it. And in particular, from 2006, Stephen Laycock, who again is with us tonight, as was one or two of the other owners or tenants. So, again, in common with one or two of them, there was a simple two-room cottage on the site before 1839, not quite sure when. It was purchased as a dower house for a Maitland widow. Again, it's money coming in from probably slave plantations in not so much the West Indies as in Virginia, in the southern states of America. Maitland comes across with his new widow, his new wife, and there was no room for the mother. And so she up sticks, moved out to a very similar property. And this is the important part here. The Flower Dew plantation in Virginia is where the money came from, the Maitland money, or part of it. And it is a tobacco plantation. And it's one of the oldest in America, and it still exists. And the woman who owned it, she came across on one of the, I think, the ship after the Mayflower. So it's one of the oldest families in America. And so the Flower Dew 100, I shan't read that out long, but it's a sort of World Heritage site. And pay close attention to the Flower Dew, because the origins of Flood are slightly controversial. And I plumped for ties to Flower Dew here. And so this is the view from Flower Dew over the James River, which is very similar, I would suggest, except slightly reverse, to the view from Flodder today looking over the Dee. And it may well have triggered a memory for Grace Maitland. If she had to get out of Barcaple because her son had brought a wife home that perhaps she didn't quite get on with, then she may as well go somewhere nice that resembled where she was born. And that is, we don't have any real records of the house that was on the Flower Dew plantation, but there's a very similar one from a Virginia plantation. And we begin to see many of the architectural similarities. Now, we don't know who built Flodder, very similar to our Grennan house, but when you see it, particularly with the porch, it's beginning to look similar when you also look at the hillside location and the river. And this is the original layout as it would be built about 1839, 1840. And in the front there, we can just see to our left of the porch, we can see Betsy Maitland. She's in a text box. About one of the few pictures we have. And so Maitland money went into it. A team of stonemasons, carpenters, builders were employed, somewhat classical lines, very similar to the other three houses, a status symbol, a statement of wealth. You might be interested to know that a stonemason in Kirkcudbright in 1840 was earning 2 shillings and sixpence a day. I think most of us know what that meant. About 12.5p. And a carpenter, if you could get them, would have been 2 shillings a day. So it went up in about not much more than a year, and is built round some of the footings from the original 2-bedroom cottage. In fact, I think one of the walls in the dining room is virtually a solid stone wall, an exterior wall, which more or less came to light when it was revamped in 2006. But into it moved 3 ladies of status, a widow and her 2 stepdaughters of David Maitland of Barcaple. He was tobacco plantation owner, and he married Susanna Polythres, the daughter of the tobacco plantation owner, the Flower Dew plantation. And they had come from Norfolk on the about 1640 across into America. We have, it's difficult to say, but just on the right there, you can see what we used to call in England an orangery. I'm not quite sure what it's called in Scotland, but it's probably a similar. And it no longer exists, but it does play an important part in some of the history of the place, because they loved producing their own. And so much of Floda's history involves food production, producing for themselves. So I think that Floda, its origins are largely because of the Flower Dew plantation and the connections, bearing in mind that the first lady to design it or to have it built for her was born there. Others have suggested that the old cottage it was built over was somehow called Flood Hall or Flood Hall, and is marked on somewhat later maps. But I personally find it more convincing the mixture of the Maitland property and Flower Dew, the position on the river, and Susanna Polythres and her house called Flower Dew in America. So that's about as close as we can get. Now, here we have its role in World War II. Now, obviously, I don't want to go into too much detail, but when I was looking at some of the research into this, I found that it actually played quite an important part in World War II. It took an awful lot of evacuees, and it played a full part there, because most people are probably aware that evacuation was in two tranches. At first, in the 39 to 40 period, whole schools were moved down here, and whole streets in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Motherwell, Clydebank. When they went back after the Phoney War, a whole series of families came down on private arrangements, and Floda was reasonably full for some of the time with evacuated children. But I think they all drifted back to Glasgow and Clydebank, in that Kirkcudbright was rather too quiet for it, I suspect. We also have, it was billeted soldiers. I think many houses in Kirkcudbright had it, and up at the range. But it was a commando unit, not Royal Marine Commando, which we have today. It was an army commando. And they were billeted, and they were training up and down all over Scotland. And as a unit, they went off to D-Day. And of course, the residents in Floda hoped that they would all survive. They did survive. One was badly wounded, but it's one of the few commando units that didn't lose terribly many people. So in some ways, it was a lucky house. Digging for victory. Stuart Charters, one of the boys, or the only boy who was ever born up there and lived there as a youngster, he worked with a will, digging, growing, and throwing himself into it. what was produced up there, pretty in common with many places, but rose hips were gathered, potatoes, chickens, turkeys, everything was new houses, chicken houses were built, rabbits, hutches, everything. It was an immense amount of food. Much of it was often given to less fortunate than themselves. And another one, of course, it was a house where they kept an eye on their neighbours. As we know, German parachutists and nuns disguised as Germans, or Germans disguised as nuns were, I'd love to see the other one. But the intelligence services popped round one day asking if they could keep an eye on Ellen Bank using one of the top windows in their bedroom, little round porthole. I've been up there to have a peek. You can get a jolly decent view of Ellen Bank if you're ever interested in popping in there. But obviously someone has reported suspicious characters at Ellen Bank. Probably something doesn't change. But so they kept their eye on it. They did their patriotic duty, because I know we're laughing, but if you thought there was something dodgy going through, people reported it then. And it was certainly worth going. And of course, again, Stuart Lachlan, he was a ferocious collector of your railings, your saucepans, anything. And he and the Scouts terrorised this part of Kirkcudbright. Absolutely terrorised them with taking everybody's pots and pans and taking them off and making stories up, because much of this comes from his book, of imagining that in the sky above was Granny's pot, or Ellen Banks' cooking pot, shooting down a German or whatever. The fact they couldn't see it was no bar to imagination. But certainly the Scouts and their hand carts were there. And the owner, who'd come across from, we have forestry in Nigeria, offered his services as a chemist and would go off to the arms production area at Dalbeattie. And he must have been important, because the train would stop, especially at the back of Florida, to pick him up and take him all the way. And so we've got, unbelievably, they also practiced shooting, both in the grounds and in the drill hall downtown. So they were very similar. Of course, Princess Elizabeth set the tone of pistol lessons and shooting lessons at Buckingham Palace. And so again, we had a full range just in case the Germans turned up. Here we have a picture of the 60s showing how close the railway line. This must have really annoyed the owners, certainly the Maitlands, yes. So it really would have annoyed them, the railway line. But it does give some idea of just behind, above the railway line, you'll see what looks like some rough, worn grass. That was a football ground, because the owner was chairman of St Cuthbert's FC. So he put a football ground up there for local boys to play. And certainly the Martin family, many of us know Stuart Martin, the builder, and the various boys, they lived up there. And I dare say they're the ones that took most of the grass with them as they sort of 4 or 5 boys kicking lumps out of each other. So it has been it's been a family house, but without children. We have the current owner, who's done remarkable, I suppose, has a remarkable job in restoring the place, because in the same way the last house hasn't really had a decline, Fludell was a sad place from about, certainly from the 60s, 70s, from Mr. Beattie's time, right up to into 2004, 2005. And a lot of money's been put into it, and it's now restored to its former glory. But if I can go back very quickly, I'm conscious of time, to the owners. Esther Jackson, Lachlan at the bottom, she married Stuart. So Stuart came, he was the chap who came from Nigeria and then went off to Dalbeattie to sort of help make weapons to foil Hitler. Dr. David Jackson McAdam, very sad, he married Grace Palmer, who owned the house, and she died on honeymoon. It's very sad in Canada, and he was the chairman of a very famous chairman of St Cuthbert's, but also opened a surgery up there and was famous for giving away most of the medicines at peppercorn prices. The Charters before that, they ran Gentlemen's Outfitters in town where the old Royal Bank used to be, and it's now Clan. And so they moved up. They inherited it or bought it from David Campbell, who was related to the Maitlands, but never lived there. So again, it's a humble house, but certainly the Maitland one, and of course their connection with Cumston, with Barcaple, and the connection with Campbellton is one that I think is worthy of note. I haven't really spent a lot of time on much else, but mostly because it's just a house that people lived in, and it's provided, as I said at the start, really quite a welcome refuge for ladies that otherwise would have had to maybe tenant or to rent some of these houses that we have been looking at. So it gave them status. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen, a quick resume to keep us to time. I'm conscious of time.